Are you looking to avoid disease or at least slow the progression? If so, this might be one of the most important videos you ever watch. I'm Steve Wright, co-creator of Solving Leaky Gut, and I'm having a conversation with Dr. Tom O'Brien, one of the world's leading gluten and intestinal permeability researchers and teachers. We're talking about how people commonly pour fuel on the fire that is disease in their bodies, and that there's ways through things like gut health, for instance, that we can turn off the fuel source and maybe begin to reverse that disease. Let's listen.
Any condition that you are having, you're feeling, and you're going to your doctor and you're doing a treatment and it's not working. So when the treatment is not working very well, one of the common reasons why it may not be, given that it's the right treatment, one of the common reasons is that there's still inflammation. You know, the body is fighting somehow and producing all this inflammation. And the rule is stop throwing gasoline on the fire, right? And the mechanism that these inflammatory molecules, these macromolecules get through is very commonly intestinal permeability. Now, I just went on PubMed, and all of your listeners can do that. It's PubMed, stands for Public Medical Information, and it's pubmed.gov, G-O-V. It's the National Library of Medicine. And it opens up right onto the search engine. You can type in that search engine anything you want to know about in terms of health. And there are 15 million papers that come up at your access here. And, you know, for example, I typed in intestinal permeability, and immediately what comes up is 10,512 studies on intestinal permeability, and the first 20 are on page 1, and the next 20 are on page 2. There's 526 pages here of studies on intestinal permeability, and all this information is free at the National Library of Medicine. So if you wonder if this intestinal permeability relates to you, just go in there and type in intestinal permeability and and a gallbladder, for example, and I'm doing that right now. And what pops up is 42 studies on intestinal permeability and gallbladder problems, intestinal permeability and heart. And when you type that one in, I mean, this is a way that I screen to see if there's any potential correlation between different conditions, and could it possibly relate to intestinal permeability. And when you do intestinal permeability in heart, there's 172 studies that pop up immediately. So any brain dysfunction, any muscle problems, muscle fatigue, chronic fatigue is very commonly associated with this, and it's the missing link so that people don't really get well from chronic fatigue. Fibromyalgia, it may be associated with an intestinal permeability. I don't know of any condition, Steve, that may not be associated with intestinal permeability. That doesn't mean that every condition is associated with intestinal permeability, but every condition may be associated with intestinal permeability. So if you don't get the results in the protocols you're doing, you might want to consider intestinal permeability. It is so very common.
Yeah, I think it's a little hard even for me sometimes to think that this might be one of the underlying causes of so many, like it almost relates to everything. And until I come back to the reality that the gut is the only way for us to get nutrients into our body. And like you were talking about, or like you've mentioned a few times, that inflammation at the site in which we're supposed to absorb nutrients is a really bad thing. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about, you know, why is inflammation and having those cytokines in the immune system working properly at the gut level, what does that do to the rest of the body? Like what happens when it starts to go crazy?
Let me give you an example. We know that autoimmune diseases are the number 3 cause of getting sick and dying in the world. It's called morbidity and mortality. The number 3 cause. You know, and if someone has MS, they go to a neurologist. If someone has psoriasis, they go to a dermatologist. If someone has rheumatoid arthritis, they go to a rheumatologist. Everyone goes to specialists depending on what their symptoms are, and they get a diagnosis of an autoimmune condition. But the mechanisms that cause these autoimmune conditions are very, very similar. Very similar. And the research started coming out back in 2005 saying that, there's a trilogy in the development of autoimmune conditions that seem to be common in most of them, if not all. This trilogy is, first, you've got a genetic vulnerability to that particular condition. And, it's like if you pull at a chain, the chain always breaks at the weakest link. It could be at one end, the middle, the other end. It's your heart, your liver, your brain, your kidney, your spleen. Wherever your genetic weak link is, that's the deck of cards you were dealt in life. That's not going away. That's your genes. So the first in the development of autoimmune conditions is a genetic vulnerability. The second thing in the development of autoimmune conditions is environmental triggers. The straw that broke the camel's back. Just too much insult to the body, and that tissue gets damaged, and boom, here it comes. Here come the symptoms. So the environmental triggers that build up that we're exposed to, and the most common environmental trigger that we have in this world today is food. We eat 2, 3, 4 times a day, every day, and nothing gets as much exposure to the inside of our bodies as what we put in our mouths. So if we look at that for a moment, the food that we choose to eat as the category of an environmental trigger, that some of these things are triggers, that they're not the best food. And the third thing that's been identified in the development of autoimmune conditions, number 3 cause of getting sick in the world, is intestinal permeability. So our researchers have said you can arrest, meaning stop, the development of autoimmune disease if you heal the gut. That's why intestinal permeability is so important to consider. Do I have intestinal permeability? And if you do have intestinal permeability, if it's identified, it's so important to treat it thoroughly so that you stop throwing gasoline on the fire in your brain, if that's where the weak link is, or you stop throwing gasoline on the fire in your blood vessels, if that's where your genetic weak link is, and you stop throwing gasoline on the fire in your gallbladder, if that's where your genetic weak link is. And my point is, it will manifest wherever the weak link is in your chain, but the mechanism that causes it is very, very similar. So the mechanisms that cause rheumatoid is very similar to the mechanisms that may cause Parkinson's. They're very similar. They're not identical, but the concepts are that they're very similar. Then you can arrest these environmental triggers getting into the bloodstream, throwing gasoline on the fire, pulling on your chain, if you identify intestinal permeability, if you've got it, and then heal the gut.